The topic is globalization and development, and I'll just introduce the three speakers right off the bat. We have Ronaldo Munk, professor of sociology at Dublin City University, Ireland. I was talking Karl Polanyi for Latin America, development and social transformation. Of course, he's my colleague as well in the Development Studies Association of the UK and Ireland. The UK often forget the Ireland here. And then Richard Sandbrook, professor emeritus, political science, University of Toronto, who we've been seeing for many years here. I recognize you, although, you know. And the double movement, opportunity structures, and social democratic dilemmas. And I also just noticed this very interesting looking book that he's just published.
Yes.
Yeah, Reinventing the Left. So it looks very interesting with Cambridge University Press. And lastly, Peter Utting, International Coordinator, Center for Social Economy, Managua, Nicaragua, and former Deputy Director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, who many of us know for their important work in social policy, for instance. And he's talking on the changing contours of advocacy, economy, and regulation, assessing the implications for development and transformative change. So, if we just go in the order of, we'll start with Ronaldo.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about a different Karl Polanyi than the one that's been spoken to hitherto. This is a Polanyi seen from the south, and he looks quite different, and he feels quite different, as I shall try to explain. In the first session, Karl Polanyi referred to a possible fifth institution in the Great Transformation, which could have been political colonialism. Enzo Mingione also centred imperialism in his presentation, but then it sort of tended to disappear a little bit from the horizon. And I was trying to think that through and rereading Fred and Margaret's really very impressive and very useful book on Karl Polanyi. But something struck me and I was uncomfortable about it. And then I went back, and at the start of the book, they say the premise is that politics, most people don't want politics in their lives, and that allows neoliberalism to sort of provide an answer through the market. But that's entirely the opposite in Latin America. In Latin America, there's been for the last 10 years a ferment of interest in politics, a ferment of governments from the left, social movements from the left, and it simply doesn't apply. So, inevitably people are shaped by where they are and how they think. But we need to be careful about universalizing what's our particular situation. So having said that, who is this Karl Polanyi? It's Karl Polanyi, the development theorist. And the way I would read him, very much someone who writes from the periphery, from Hungary at the turn of the century, industrializing the creation of political movements. Then someone on the periphery of the academic system, working for the WA in England, over here and that. So I think that's different. Same way Antonio Gramsci can only be understood as someone who comes from the Mezzogiorno, from the south of Italy. For all he becomes the icon of cultural Marxism in the West, the reality of Gramsci is someone who comes from the underdeveloped part of Italy. So I think Polanyi can be seen very much in those terms. And I want to make 3 points, really. I want to look at the relevance of the work on non-capitalist societies to Latin American studies, the relevance of the marketization, the first bit of the double movement, and thirdly, the relevance of the counter-movement to recent events in Latin America. The Polanyi is a development theorist. I mean, he wrote a very influential critique of Walt Rostow's stages of economic growth, always a very holistic, anti-deterministic understanding of development, a fierce critic of the Rostow influence in terms of modernization theory. And also very interesting from my point of view, a piece in 1949 on economic history and the problem of freedom, a criticism of the Marxist or mechanical Marxist understandings of development. He writes how Marxist determinism is based on some kind of railway timetable of social development. I really like that phrase, the railway timetable theory of development. Upon slave society followed feudalism, upon feudalism followed capitalism, capitalism socialism. And that was true. Those of us writing in the 80s in terms of modes of production, it was fairly mechanical. concept we would have had. So I think that's extremely useful. I think Polanyi's talking about the sort of post-development approach. I think it fits very much with, you think of the likes of Arturo Escobar in Latin America writing about post-development, the critique of the dominant, universalizing, arrogant discourses of the North, as Escobar puts it. The emphasis on culture, the emphasis on culture, the massive events, slavery, whatever massive events in development are not just economic or political, but for Polanyi, they're cultural events. I think that fits very much with current trends in development theory. So that's really just by way of introduction. The work on social embeddedness, so I suppose this talk of the paper, which Ana Gomez said she'll circulate later, it's trying to look at where Polanyi has become embedded and where he hasn't become embedded in Latin American development studies. And there are reasons for that misencounter. The reasons why Polanyi would not have been read in the 70s or 80s, maybe not until the mid-90s in any big way in Latin America, would have been the dominance of a certain type of Marxism, Althusserian Marxism, which derided, for example, the young Marx. So anyone associated with anything humanistic would have been quite sort of taboo. And I would have shared that. I mean, Michael Mann tried to get me to read The Great Transformation as a student. And I said, nah, sorry, this is very humanistic stuff, like, you know. We're going for the hard-edged Althusserian Marxism. But gradually it has been. There's been a niche, I think, in Polanyian influenced studies in relation to subsistent growers. William Rosebery and Karl Smith, for example, in the early 80s and early 90s. The way Latin American peasants have, to an extent, always been embedded in relationships of redistribution and reciprocity outside of the market. Within Latin America, there's a strong tradition going back to José Carlos Mariátegui in the 1920s, looking at Inca societies in terms of reciprocity and redistribution. And that's now coming back through the discourse in the Andean countries of Evo Morales and that type of left, which is rediscovering the pre-conquest cultural civilizations. I think Polanyi's influence there is very, very strong. And as some of you probably know, in the book with Arnsberg and Pearson, Trade Market in the Early Empire, the chapter there by Anne Chapman on Aztec and Mayan civilizations and the port of trade enclaves. That sort of strand of thinking has influenced. But then I suppose the big, where Polanyi completely scores is in the analysis of the turn to neoliberalism in the late 80s, early 90s. It's like a textbook application of the Great Transformation, like the way the market colonizes all parts of society. And yet, Polanyi wasn't big on the horizon. And perhaps, and I'm not entirely sure about that, but perhaps one reason was that it was Gramsci's thinking, which was coming in on the left, to try to unpack the previous, if you want, ultimatist types of politics, the armed struggle period and so on. So Gramsci brings back in the discourse of democracy. But in retrospect, there's a book by Eduardo Silva, for example, looking at that period, the Polanyian framework is a very, very rich one for understanding what was happening. The whole commodification, the whole way in which the market, just even its relationship to force. I mean, it's a very brutal form of neoliberalism. And just think it wasn't Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan who started it, but Augusto Pinochet. And I think Reagan and Thatcher were bad enough. Try living in Chile in the mid-70s. And that was sort of red in tooth and claw, or whatever the expression is. I suppose where today Polanyi becomes most interesting from a Latin American perspective is that it's the counter movement. Now clearly, over the last 10 years, like I would have got seriously engaged with Polanyi because precisely the counter movement explains that the neoliberal phase will not go on forever. There's a very pessimistic view on the left. Some people call this false necessitarianism. Things have to be as they are. A Brazilian philosopher, Roberto Mangabeira Unger, uses that phrase. I think what the Great Transformation shows and the double movement shows that there are forces within society countering that brutality of marketization. So now Polanyi is widely read in Latin America, and I think it would be fair to say mainly in relation to the social economy. So this idea that there are germs of and I wouldn't call it mode of production, but a new way of making society, various cooperative movements and various bottom-up movements, particularly in Brazil and in the Andean countries. And you had that, for example, in Argentina, after the collapse of the economy in 2001, return to barter economy. So suddenly there, Polanyi becomes very, very topical and very, very relevant. So I think now it's beginning to really, Polanyi sort of coming into the Latin American debates in a very big way in relation to the third sector. I think there's a debate to be had there, by the way, on what this actually means. And I would tend to agree with Gareth Dale, who argues that decommodification may be symptomatic of social disintegration rather than the emergence of vital and durable relations capable of reproducing and sustaining themselves in opposition to capital. I think there's a rose-tinted spectacle thing going on, especially from the north. People say, well, isn't this wonderful and all these things happening? But maybe they're not so wonderful. Maybe they're there of necessity, and I'm not so sure about celebrating them as an alternative and what that means in terms of national economic development. Because in a sense we haven't gone away from national economic development for all the globalization theories. And I think development theory is going back to that. Like Brazilian economic strategy is Brazilian economic strategy. It's not the world, it's not Latin America. So I think that decommodification might be an imposed process rather than necessarily a liberatory impulse. If 9 out of 10 new jobs in Latin America are in the informal sector, by necessity they will take these non-market forms. And in my last 2 minutes, so those are the three areas, the non-capitalist, pre-capitalist analysis, and coming back very much into its own. It's always been there with the likes of William Rosebery and small peasant production. The long night of neoliberalism and textbook application of the Great Transformation, and then the more recent decommodification, the counter movement, and how Polanyi helps illustrate that. But I think also, by the way, I think Latin America helps enrich Polanyi. I think that's I think it should be a two-way process. So last but not least, I suppose, as we mentioned, the question of the Pope in Eduardo Bergoglio, as we call him, not Pope Francis. It is very interesting. And Latin America is one part of the world where people don't run for the hills when the word religion's mentioned. You go back to Mariatti, as mentioning, it was the Latin America's Gramsci in the 1920s. Very much socialism and Christianity going hand in hand. So Polanyi's view, and if you go through the material he wrote for the Christian left training weekends in the mid-30s, and the teaching of Jesus being about community and so on, that fits very much with the way this current Pope is reinterpreting Catholicism. But here again, I suppose there's also rose-tinted spectacle thing, and I get into debates in Ireland because that's where I live, and people think that this Pope should already be canonised. He's so wonderful, but I think it has to be read politically, and I think the conference with Polanyi's thinking that there's a real synergy and real coming together of global implications. And being disciplined, I'm going to finish on time.
Well, you're ahead of time, so if you want to...
No?
No, okay, well, okay. Wonderful, thank you. So we'll just go straight on to the other two presentations.
So reinventing the left in the global south actually it's animated by Polanyian concepts. And my talk today is directly focusing on the issue of the contemporary relevance of some key Polanyian ideas. So I would like to say, however, that the obvious point is that a 15-minute summary of a 34-page papers strips away all nuance. So if you would like to read the nuanced version, do refer to the paper, which is in your memory stick. So I contend in the paper that Polanyi's double movement construct, suitably conceived, possesses considerable analytical leverage in explaining contemporary political phenomena, especially when it is combined with Polanyi's implicit concept of opportunity structures. To illustrate this explanatory leverage, I focus on the dilemmas and possibilities of the democratic left in the global south, especially Latin America. Now I say a few words about the double movement construct. We probably all agree that Polanyi's concept of the double movement provides remarkable leverage in his historical and holistic explanation of Europe's civilizational crisis of the early 20th century. But I, along with many others, am contending that one can speak of a theory. Trouble with using iPad, you put your finger in the wrong place and you end up at the end of the paper.
Yeah, I noticed that.
So excuse me for a second, I get back to wherever I was. Oh, yeah. But I contend, along with others, that one can speak of a theory of broader applicability than simply an explanation of the First Great Transformation, one that models the dialectical dynamics of liberal capitalism in general. Although there is controversy over whether whether Polanyi was consistent in his formulation, he usually understood the double movement as involving an irreconcilable contradiction that came to a head in the early 20th century. The Polanyian dilemma is that neither the liberal movement nor the counter-movement of societal protection could resolve the economic and political crisis. The obvious conclusion is that systemic transformation in the form of democratic socialism was needed to resolve the crisis and advance human freedom. I contend, however, that hindsight supports the view that the movement-counter-movement conflict is more akin to a persistent tension within capitalism than an irreconcilable contradiction. This persistent tension periodically breeds crisis, but for considerable periods, the tension may be accommodated through societal accords or class compromises. In other words, the movement and the counter-movement are, at least potentially, not wholly incompatible. If so, progressive governments, regardless of whether their long-term goal is socialist or not, would be able provisionally to tame the destructive propensities of markets within capitalism while still promoting competitive industries. Yet such accords, though sometimes lengthy, as in the case of the Keynesian Accord, can only be provisional. That is so because the relative strength of the movement and the counter-movement waxes and wanes in response to economic performance, the unity of capital and its allies, ideological shifts, and geopolitics. There are 4 reasons for holding that the soft version of Polanyi is more persuasive than the hard version that regards socialism as the only solution to the contradiction. Briefly, they are as follows. First, it is unconvincing to contend, as Polanyi seems to do, that disembeddedness either exists or not. He argues that the logic of a market system necessitates free market self-regulation, i.e. disembeddedness. Anything less will lead to economic crisis and ultimate disaster. But the real world rarely produces such pure cases. Disembeddedness is more accurately conceived as a continuous than a dichotomous variable. If disembedding is rather a matter of degree, not an either-or condition, then commodifying and decommodifying tendencies can coexist within the same society. Secondly, we know that in actual practice, modus vivendi between the movement and the counter-movement have worked successfully for a considerable time, and I've already alluded to the Keynesian Accord, which ran from approximately 1948 to the mid-1970s. Thirdly, certain of the counter-movement's demands today are in principle compatible with profitability in a largely market economy, and thus the basis for an accommodation exists. It is true, of course, that firms commonly pursue competitiveness on the basis of price alone in this neoliberal era. But there is another approach, championed by moderate social democrats in the global south, which protects people and nature while fostering profitability. I will deal with the rudiments of this approach in a few minutes. Fourthly, it cannot be assumed that capital is necessarily and unanimously a stalwart champion of the liberal movement for a self-regulating economy, or invariably opposed to state intervention on behalf of the counter-movement. Some firms, of course, are threatened by free market doctrine. Other firms are willing to engage, or eager to appear to compete in export markets, but demand extensive governmental assistance in doing so. And many firms realize that the importance of gaining some kind of industrial relations, some agreement with labor, which actually facilitates capital accumulation. My point is that state developmentalism is a prominent feature of moderate social democracy in the global south, and state developmentalism, in the context of hard-fought elections, lends itself to striking accords between the counter-movement, which after all includes sections of capital, and the liberal movement. I suggest that these factors indicate the potential for a class compromise, reconciling market competitiveness with social citizenship, and directed to the promotion of industrialization. But to say that an accord is possible is not to suggest that it is easy to achieve. In this paper, I proceed to compare this model of the double movement to two similar approaches to understanding the intrinsic contradictions of liberal democratic capitalism. They are both classic studies, James O'Connor's Fiscal Crisis of the State of 1973, and Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis's Democracy and Capitalism, Property, Community, and the Contradictions of Modern Social Thought of 1988. I don't have time here to pursue this comparison, which I think is actually very fruitful to undertake. I do carry that through in the paper, but I would just record my conclusion, which is that the Polanyian model is superior even in this august company. Next, I turn to the role of the left in the double movement. I've suggested that a particular model of the double movement sheds light on the dilemmas and prospects of the left, and I turn now to elaborate this judgment. In the paper, I discuss what I mean by the democratic left and the varieties that comprise it. But time restrictions prevent me from entering into this discussion. Suffice it to say that the democratic left includes both parties that seek accommodations or class accords and those that seek to transcend the tension altogether by engaging in class struggle with the aim of installing socialism. In this discussion, I'll restrict myself to the moderate social democratic tendency, which is the most common variety, evident in such contemporary cases as Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, Mauritius, and Kerala, a state of India, for example. The dilemma facing the Social Democratic Party or coalition on assuming power is obviously acute. On the one hand, the moderate left, to sustain itself in the long run, must attend to the demands of the liberal movement, because capital flight and capital strike will undercut the robust economic growth on which the moderate left's success hinges. It is growth that generates the good jobs and revenues to abolish poverty, expand and upgrade public services, and raise generalized prosperity. On the other hand, The Progressive Party, to retain its popular support, must extend and deepen social and political citizenship and the social economy in accordance with its pronounced commitments. Now, it is obviously very difficult to simultaneously reassure the economic elites that their interests are secure while redistributing income, services, social protection, and a degree of political power to the economically insecure and often angry constituencies of the left. The accord that attempts this difficult reconciliation has the following features, 5 features. First, macroeconomic orthodoxy in the form of commitments to keep inflation and budget deficits low while accepting free trade. Secondly, restraints on the commodifying effects of markets with particular reference to labor and money markets. Third, the promotion of equal freedom through generating good jobs, instituting real increases in the minimum wage, and the provision of education, health, and housing services, and using cash transfers and an increasingly universal welfare state to reduce poverty and augment social citizenship. Fourth, the extension of participatory institutions, though mainly at the local level, to avoid populist pressures on the national government. And fifthly, a modest program of land redistribution, where land is unequally distributed, together with a modest inclination to safeguard state-owned enterprises, especially in utilities and the oil or gas sector. I suggest that moderate social democracy is best conceived as an alternative to neoliberalism within capitalism. In the paper, I use the case of Brazil to illustrate this accord and the strains with which the administration must deal. In the paper and also in the book, I analyze 2 pitfalls into which progressive governments have fallen in trying to maneuver between the clashing logics of the movement and the counter-movement. I have time merely to mention them here. First, macroeconomic populism. One pitfall to which progressive governments succumb is a deadly embrace of major elements of the counter-movement in the context of an adverse opportunity structure. Closely fought elections prod leftist parties to escalate their promises, and often their patronage machines as well, to attract support. If the new administration then yields to the populist temptation, inflammatory rhetoric combined with redistributive measures, augmented clientelism, expansionary economic policies, and increases in minimum wages while controlling prices, the result can be disastrous. Capital flight, inflation, balance of payments deficits, growing unemployment, falling state revenues induce an economic crisis and eventually a political crisis as well. And sadly, the crises victimize the very groups that the policies were intended to help. And I have case studies of Sri Lanka and Michael Manley's Jamaica in the 1970s and Venezuela in the 1970s and 80s. Secondly, and alternatively, the moderate left may focus single-mindedly on the policy agenda of the liberal movement at the expense of decommodification and redistribution. Although most leftist governments since 1990 have had to selectively adopt neoliberal policies and accept many pre-existing market reforms, in some cases these governments have accommodated neoliberalism to the point of instituting what I would call social liberalism, or the third way, which is a centrist position. They have done so for various reasons: fear of panicking investors and alienating the IMF or the American government, acceptance of technocratic advice that neoliberalism is the only game in town, internal divisions, and self-advancement as a new political elite undergoes embourgeoisement, and emulation of the Chinese case. Concerning the third way, the issue here is whether the leftist leadership has misread the prevailing opportunity structure, that in fact there may have been more leeway for change, or whether self-aggrandizement is the more important motivation for the leadership in negotiating so little for its poor and middle-class constituencies. I employ the case of South Africa and the ANC to discuss this important issue. In short, the moderate social democratic strategy of striking an accord between the movement and the counter-movement can be a viable option even in highly inegalitarian societies, but it is a strategy that is difficult to carry off successfully. Pitfalls abound when the progressive government becomes entangled in the double movement. The final part of the paper refers to the supplementary concept of opportunity structures as a way of understanding what shapes the left strategy in dealing with the intrinsic tensions within capitalism, and also understanding the success achieved by the left under very difficult circumstances. And the opportunity structure is a concept developed by Fred Bloch and Margaret Summers in 1984 as what they call an implicit concept of Polanyi's. And as we all know, Polanyi was adept in the Great Transformation in interrelating global relations and institutions with structural and historical conditions at the national level, and then seeing both in relation to domestic agents of change in the form of political movements, leaders, and ideologies. The global opportunity structure constrains what national states can achieve. The national opportunity structure, in turn, affects whether social and political movements can actually seize the opportunities presented by the global opportunity structure. Although much more needs to be said about the opportunity structures, my point is that the concept is an important supplement to the double movement, because it's a way of organizing all the contingent structural factors that bear on the strategy of the left and the degree of success they achieve in whatever strategy they assume. So to sum up, in my view, the double movement, if interpreted as a persistent tension within capitalism rather than an irreconcilable contradiction, remains highly relevant for understanding, in this case, the dilemmas and promise of today's democratic left, especially when this model is supplemented with the concept of opportunity structures. Thank you.
Great. So, keeping on theme, I think we should have called this the Latin America and Globalization and Developments panel. But in any case, Peter will talk to us about Nicaragua more specifically.
One thing Ronaldo and I have in common, we were both at the same university, Essex University, in the 70s, so I too wasn't allowed to read Polanyi back and then coming to Polanyi quite late in life. First, let me say a big thanks to Margie and Karl for this invitation, not only to be with amongst such an insightful and fantastic group of scholars, but it's also, I retired from UNRIST 2 months ago, and so this is really an opportunity for me to start a project I had in mind, which was to try and pull together different strands of work, things I've been working on for the last 15, 20 years. So the projects I've been coordinating at UNRIST were very much on things like global justice activism, on corporate social responsibility, where Jose Carlos Marquez has joined us this morning, on new forms of business regulation, and most recently on social and solidarity economy. And the idea I have, which I try to develop in the paper, is that there are all these sort of new forms of activism and collective action which fit very nicely, which I'll be looking at in a sort of separated way, but fit very nicely under the umbrella of the double movement. And just as a bit of background to where I'm coming from, in the paper I'm really looking at, I think, spaces for action. On the first day we heard quite a bit about not only the critique of neoliberalism, but also ideas about utopian blueprints and alternatives. I'm coming from a different perspective. I was 10 years with the revolutionary process in Nicaragua, implementing the agrarian reform there after the revolution in 1979. And given all that happened, I'm sort of a little bit wary about massive blueprints of societal change. Then I went into the United Nations. And there I was in a fairly mainstream institution, some progressive tendencies within it, but I had to find spaces to try and influence the policy agendas and the discursive agendas that were happening. So I've become a fan of spaces to try and do something in this world where so many walls are up there and which block progress. So that's sort of where I'm coming from on this, politically, I guess. So as I said, so we're looking at sort of contemporary dimensions of the double movement in today's world. So what has changed from the days of the golden era where we had sort of the labour movement very much in the driving seat, or philanthropy, etc. So what we see, I think, are new forms of social control of business and markets, which go beyond the labour movement and philanthropy, and this is the focus of the paper. Then I'll get into what I call the corporate accountability movement, which is the role of contestation and advocacy for often harder forms of regulation, bringing the state back into regulation, going beyond the sort of the practice and discourse of corporate social responsibility, corporate self-regulation. Then the second part of these actions relates to what we can call civil regulation. It's where non-state actors are assuming, including civil society organizations, are assuming direct responsibility for setting standards, auditing, certification, etc. And the third is the idea of social solidarity economy, where we have producers and workers exercising direct control over more socialized economic activities and circuits that go well beyond the idea of the capitalist enterprise. And then try and draw out some implications and challenges for what we call transformative change. So the corporate accountability is this sort of a very eclectic range of different civil society actors, which arose particularly in the context of a set of corporate scandals in the 1980s with Bhopal, with Exxon Valdez, with the first sort of ideas of sweatshops with Nike and others. And new forms of activism arose, sort of the anti-sweatshop movement, the focus on getting rid of child labour, or the environmental activism against mining, oil, logging companies, the tax justice movement, the anti-free trade movements, particularly in Latin America. And this combination of sort of old and new social movements tactics coming together. So we have the ongoing protests, the naming and shaming of corporations, shareholder activism, trying to bring resolutions at annual general meetings to try and improve social environmental practices of a corporation, social auditing, using a whole range of complaints mechanisms or grievance procedures to try and seek redress for harms that have been done. A lot of work through watchdog organizations and others, sort of generating critical expert knowledge to participate in what we call policy dialogues or epistemic communities, and overt sort of lobbying by civil society groups. So on each of these types, set fields of action, I sort of in the paper try and distill some of the pros, more positive aspects, and what are some of the tensions and problems. So as regards the corporate accountability movement, I think clearly on the plus side, we clearly see a situation where corporations can now run to all sorts of deregulated parts of the world, but it's difficult for them to hide, and a whole range of watchdog organizations that now exist, trying to detect and expose wrongdoing. And many of these watchdog organizations are networked globally, so something that happens locally can now be brought to global attention. What I think the movement has done is shifted this corporate social responsibility agenda beyond the initial sort of very weak forms of a company just saying it has a code of conduct or a set of principles, to what they call in the field MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification. So it's sort of a more mature phase of corporate social responsibility. As we'll see with the initiatives I'm about to talk about, it's also been a stimulus for NGOs and others taking direct responsibility for setting standards and trying to regulate business. In the field of advocacy and lobbying, clearly a lot's being done in terms of accessing and influencing policy processes and epistemic communities. As a lot of the social movements literature sort of suggests, often these sort of movements have more success in framing agendas and policy debates rather than significantly transforming policy. And I think in the case of the corporate accountability movement, we see this. They've kept issues, they've brought issues back onto the agenda, they've addressed certain blind spots in the sort of the mainstream reformist agenda. As I mentioned before, the using and testing of complaints mechanisms and procedures to seek redress. And this, Peter Evans, I think, said it's important for those engaged in activism to organize on a scale commensurate with the opposition. So if we're trying to get a capital, we have to organize locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally. And with these sorts of movements, you see that through the different types of networking and multi-scalar activism that's happening. On the downside, we're often talking about organizations that are heavily constrained in terms of resources. Not only that, within the whole field of development assistance, you see this shift from supporting organizations engaged in advocacy to service delivery NGOs, and since the crisis, even major cuts to NGO funding. The sustainability question, that often it's difficult to sustain interest in particular issues, or campaigns tend to have a sort of short shelf life. Relatively weak participation, yes, in policy processes, but a seat at the table doesn't mean you're a player in any real sense of the term, and so relatively weak voice and vote within policy process. And all this has to be seen, because there's often a tendency in this field to fixate on what's being done in terms of activism and to lose sight of what's happening in the field of the increasing strengthening of business power, something I referred to yesterday and was presented in terms of what I call the increasing structural power of business, the instrumental power, and the discursive power of business. And we've seen these sort of power increase dramatically. So what we have to look at is not just what activists are doing, but the correlation of forces between them and others. So on civil regulation, so this idea, we take sort of Braithwaite's notion of what problematically perhaps called the regulatory state, but what he's trying to suggest there is that what's happening under neoliberalism, as we heard yesterday, isn't just about deregulation, it's about re-regulation, and part of that re-regulation is the idea that states delegate regulatory authority to non-state actors. Now, often that's assumed by business associations and corporations, but it's also a space there for civil society organizations to engage directly in a whole set of regulatory functions to do with setting standards, auditing, certification, etc. So we did a book on this called Business Regulation and Non-State Actors, where we looked at 20 of these new initiatives where NGOs play a significant part. And some have a sort of a global, multi-sectoral focus, like the Global Reporting Initiative, ethical trading initiatives. Others focus on a single industry or single issue, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Forest Stewardship Council. Others have much more of a rights, often workers' rights-based focus. And others have, say, more of a social solidarity economy focus, like those associated with fair trade and organic agriculture. On the pro side, on the plus side, we see definitely expanding scope of all these types of initiatives, covering much more and more industries. As I say, there's sort of been a conduit for more sort of meaningful corporate social responsibility. What we also see is what often starts off as fairly minimalist standards tend to get ratcheted up through time, both because of insider pressures from civil society organizations or external pressures, say Greenpeace, pressuring the Roundtable on Responsible Palm Oil, and you get a sort of ratcheting up of standards taking place. And that often these standards are becoming the basis for international or national regulation and law. So this idea of a sort of private governance and public governance coming together in partly as a consequence of these initiatives. On the downside, clearly a trade-off between scale and substance. Often the ones that have much tougher standards only cover a few corporations, are very small in scope. The question of sort of possibilities of corporate capture of some of these initiatives, or what some call conventionalization, that you can start off, the design looks decent, but in implementation things tend to get diluted in terms of applying standards. And often limited consumer demand for so-called ethical production, problem with the Roundtable on Responsible Palm Oil, for example. It's not the consumer demand there to actually buy all the produce being produced by producers in these schemes. Finally, the third one then, social solidarity economy. So this idea of workers and producers actually directly controlling circuits of production and economic activities that build in more social perspectives, principles to do with equality. So what we're seeing, so this is the latest book I did, which will be coming out edited in April, with chapters by Margie and Jean-Louis Laville and others, and called Social and Solidarity Economy Beyond the Fringe. I think we have a question mark after Beyond the Fringe. So here we see in recent years the sort of resurgence of cooperatives, particularly in areas of Africa and Latin America, the rise, as we heard yesterday and the day before, on various forms of social enterprise, proximity services, the fair trade market, now a $6-7 billion market, women's self-help groups up to 2.2 million in India, urban community agriculture, community forestry initiatives, etc., and the complementary currencies which were presented in the previous panel this morning. So on the pros, I think what we have here is in terms of the transformative potential, it's interesting things that are happening. Here you have enterprises and organizations that implicitly, simultaneously are trying to address economic, social, environmental, often emancipatory objectives. So from the perspective of integrated sustainable development, it's interesting. The second is the whole problem of informal economy. 1.5 billion workers in precarious employment, the limits of formal sector absorption of those workers, and the possibility that SSE can become a pathway to transition from informal economy. 2 minutes in, I think what we're seeing, what Paul Singer, the National Secretary of the Economy Solidarity Secretariat in Brazil, calls them sort of an inchoate sort of global social movement is information. And the work we did, one of the last things I did was help set up the UN Interagency Task Force on Social and Solidarity Economy, which now has 20 agencies involved. And the first report we did was looking at the relevance of SSE for eight aspects of the Sustainable Development Agenda: employment, health, local economic development, etc., which are discussed in the paper. On the downside, I think a lot of the tensions and contradictions that associated with SSE derive from how it's articulated to the other sectors. So if we see SSE in the middle there, and its articulation with the public sector, the private, and the popular economy, a whole series of relationships there constrain what can be done in terms of SSE. So we have often disabling policy environments, or when the state does get involved, it tends to be done in a sort of top-down way that can often reduce the autonomy of social economy organizations. Restricted access to market finance, institutional isomorphism, that as these organizations grow, they tend to assume the characteristics of capitalist enterprises, etc. And so on the implications for transformative change, I think the point I want to bring out is that each of these arenas of action is highly contested, that we should avoid broad generalizations, particularly romanticizing the potential. And we need to recognize the sort of transformative limits, but also recognize the importance of embracing difference and allies within a counter-hegemonic movement. So I think on the first day we had the discussion about was social entrepreneurship, certain forms of social enterprise, was it really more fitting with a neoliberal agenda? My take on all this is that it should be seen as part of this broader, potentially a broader social solidarity economy movement. We have to embrace difference within that with the political project of building a broader counter-hegemonic movement. And I left with 3 challenges. Just the developmental challenges that within each of these perspectives you see very different meanings of development, which I talk about in the paper. The capacity building challenge, which is fairly obvious, resources, competencies. And finally, the political challenge, which is really about how we need ongoing contestation, we need co-construction, we need the multi-scalar activism that connects the different activism at different scales, and we need alliances and discursive struggle, which leads me to think that we need to remember both Polanyi and Gramsci. Thank you.
Questions?
Okay. Why do we presume that a transformation will lead to some form of democratic socialism within or without capitalism, when the argument can be made that there's just as good a chance that we're going to have some form of authoritarianism? If we look at the United States and the increasing growth of oligarchical power, the decline of the labor movement is an example. If we look at Venezuela, if we look at much of Eastern Europe, the chances are that we are inclining more towards some kind of authoritarianism, even though it may be disguised and packaged as in a different way. why do we presume that our hopes of democratic socialism will triumph?
Thank you. And next.
So this question is directed to Richard Sandbrook. The focal point of your presentation was on the social democratic left. And I'm curious where the radical left fits in. The reason I ask this question is because the left has been and continues to be very divided. So it'd be really neat to figure out how it could be reunited, if ever reunited. Because historically speaking, I mean, I want to talk about Latin America. The social democratic left criticized the radical left with respect to the experience of the Soviet Union and state socialism. On the other hand, the more radical left, if we take Marxists, criticized the social democratic left for the failure of social democracy and its current attacks on the welfare state. So it'd be really interesting to get your take on where the radical left fits in with respect to the moderate social democratic left.
Yeah. Great. Probably parallels all over the world on that question. Yes.
Hi. This is well. First, I can't resist but respond a little bit to the comment about the Pope. I completely agree with Renaud Munk's analysis of the Pope and the way in which we need to be much more critical. There's an Argentinian liberation theologian who points out that Jorge Bergoglio never smiled, actually. So we often forget the way in which even the mannerisms are very much thought out, very much part of a political project and a political strategy. But anyway, my question is quite different from that. I'm wondering, as actually throughout the conference, and even every time, actually, I think we talk about neoliberalism. And my kind of more general question is, how can we critique neoliberalism without sounding nostalgic for the welfare state? That's my question. And I'm wondering if, particularly for Renaud Munk, if what in Latin America gives us, is there what kind of critiques of neoliberalism are there that aren't this sort of simple or automatic sort of nostalgia for that welfare state?
I think if you ask, is there a problem with being nostalgic with the welfare state? But there's no one else standing, so yeah. Why don't we just go ahead and take the first round of questions and Ronaldo?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to go back on one, and it was listening to Richard reminded me of something that I really should have stressed more. The Polanyian counter movement is generally understood, writing as he did at the end of the Second World War, that the way society would protect itself from the unregulated market was mainly through the welfare state. And people in the North subconsciously just think of the welfare state. However, for the whole of the global South, it wasn't the welfare state, but the developmental state, which was the counter to the market, right? I mean, throughout Latin America, from the 30s onwards, the answer was developmental state. In post-colonial Africa, developmental state. In the rise of the East Asian Tigers, developmental state. But that's equally a Polanyian counter-movement, and I think we should always bear that in mind. And I always have discussions. I work with colleagues in Sweden quite a lot on trade unions, and we work in South Africa. And their mental framework is that the welfare state is normal. Everywhere else, if it isn't like Sweden, should be like Sweden. And yeah, I mean, why not? Like, you know. But the ANC had a debate in the early 1990s saying quite seriously, we want to create a society like Sweden. Well, you can't, you know what I mean? The historical, structural conditions are different. I also have problems, picking up there on the Pope and the social democratic left and the other left. I do have a problem with labelling Richard, and there's the tradition of analysing. Jorge Castañeda, for example, analyses the Latin American lefts. And it comes down to really good left and bad left. You know, the good left are the social democratic left, like Fernando Enrique Cardoso. The bad left are populists like Chavez and the Kirchners in Argentina. Now, it ain't that simple. It really isn't that simple at all. So how do we create an alternative that is not nostalgic for, in the case of Argentina, Peronism? That was our version of the welfare state. in the 1940s, the share of the national income going to labour went up from 30% to 45%. That is a revolution. I mean, the reality is that Peronism transformed that country, but we can't go back to that. That's unrealistic, and it can't happen for a whole series of reasons. However, we need to recover that developmental state impetus and integrate that in. And I think the Polanyi framework really comes into its own there. I was working with South African trade unions in the early 90s, and it was the Polanyi framework and the counter-movement that allowed us to break away from the sort of ultimatist, either you sell out to neoliberalism totally, or you go back to what in South Africa was a very standard Marxist-Leninist framework. And I think Polanyi opens, and Gramsci opens up alternative pathways.
Thank you. Richard.
I think the developmental state is a very, very poor model for the democratic left anywhere, because
The democratic, the developmental state in the East Asian form was an authoritarian state, very, very top-down, which also repressed labor as one of the major aspects of its attempt to promote accumulation and productivity. So if we're talking about the developmental state, then we've got to be very clear. We're talking about the democratic developmental state, which is an extremely complex kind of organization to ever get off the ground. The first question was, why do we assume that there'll be a democratic socialism or a move towards democracy rather than authoritarianism? I don't think that anybody assumes that that will actually be the case. But I think what we are interested in emphasizing is that there are a number of extremely interesting democratic left experiments in the global south, not only in Latin America, but mainly in Latin America, that we want to look at and to understand what their potential is. So I think that's how I react to that problem. As for the radical left vis-a-vis the moderate left, I certainly never subscribe to anywhere to the idea of a bad left and a good left. So I won't go further on that. I would say that within Latin America there is somewhat of a tension between the kind of moderate left leaders and the left populist, more radical leaders. But on the other hand, they have cooperated a great deal on setting up regional institutions which provide somewhat, at least potentially, of a bulwark against the global neoliberalism, trying to insulate the progressive regimes of Latin America from some of the outside pressures coming from the global governance institutions. So there's been a fair amount of cooperation, some tension. I mean, we have to remember that Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party in Brazil was, after all, a committed socialist to begin with. I mean, going back to the foundations of the Workers' Party in the late 1970s, it was a movement party with a number of various mass organizations involved in it, including workers, of course, and also radical intellectuals. And for the first 3 times he ran for the presidency, Lula da Silva did put forward a socialist program, although each time a little watered down. Until he realized, I guess, that there's, the reality is you're not going to get into power if you're come forward as a socialist. So he came forward very, very clearly with they're going to make an accord if he got to power, and this is what he actually did, and I think quite successfully. If you look, for example, at the data on income inequality in Brazil, which was massive when he came to power, it's still major, but it's come down a great deal, especially since 2006.
Great. Peter.
On the question of assuming a possible democratic socialist alternative as opposed to authoritarianism, no, I certainly don't. And I think authoritarian solutions might actually happen. But what's the key there? The key is, I think, to really emphasize the whole point of democratic participation. And I think, Jean-Louis Laville is probably the best proponent of this in relation to social and solidarity economy, that warning that the double movement, if we want to avoid the turn to fascism and communism, which we experienced historically, then we have to put democracy up there as absolutely key in all that.
And I think the other thing, I mean, what I'm trying to do is say, let's not look at broad alternatives, but look at spaces for action, where we can change, modify, adapt institutions and political arrangements to bring about, possibly change, but not this broad sweep of change. On the nostalgia for the welfare state, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, I think it's okay to be nostalgic for the welfare state, but maybe in some context, that language is no longer appropriate. So let's change the language. So what we do at UNRIST, our major program, is on social policy. Okay? And we take that a bit further, saying what's important is not only reinvigorating, refocusing attention on social policy, but also on universalism. So we critiqued heavily the first generation of conditional cash transfer programs for targeting too narrowly specific groups, and push very much for broadening those, expanding those considerably. And now what we see in UNRIST and the ILO is this focus on universal social policy or universal social security. And so you needn't use the language of the welfare state if that's a problem in some places. You can use other terms. And just Ronaldo's point about how it's, what's happening in Latin America, it's very difficult to generalize in positive or negative terms about these regimes. So I've just gone back to Nicaragua after many years of being away. And it's a whole, it's very difficult to assess what's happening. But what I see is economically, in terms of economic programs, infrastructural development programs, in terms of social programs, some really interesting things are happening. But if we take any of our conventional indicators of what we might call good governance, transparency, participation, etc., it's not happening. So it's a real mixture there. But often people come in and say, Nicaragua is populist and it's not real, the type of change we want. But in a lot of aspects, I think there are elements of a developmental state there. I think there are some very interesting broad national social programs, etc. We now have electricity. We have now probably a model energy policy for the world in terms of the mix of energies. But when it comes to how decisions are taken and verticalism and lack of autonomy of social movements, there are real issues there.
May I just ask, what is wrong with the nostalgia for the
welfare
state? Especially a universalistic welfare state. I mean, that was one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. And,
but politics of nostalgia can't create an alternative society. There is a problem with politics of nostalgia.
I don't think that this is a problem. If you take Brazil, for example, the whole idea of the conditional cash transfer to Bolsa Familia is, in fact, to move in phases toward a universal basic income. They've already extended the payments to a vastly larger group of the population. I think 1 in every 6 Brazilians now receives it, and it's been expanded every year. So, I think the notion of reaching universalism through phases is a very promising one indeed.
How about we get some more questions on that last point, because it seems to have stimulated some opinions. And just to stimulate it further, I mean, obviously the politics and nostalgia.
Just a quick comment on the last point about extending the cash transfer programs.
Yeah.
If I look back to Brazil, where I do a lot of work, to the United States, what's the probability of reaching the point where the middle class, the growing middle class that pays most of the taxes, are going to start raising their backs just as they did in the United States, and that's going to end this wonderful way of redistribution. And I think it is great to talk about it, but I wonder about it as a model, because when we did this in the United States as a welfare program, it also helped a lot of people. But again, in terms of the broad notion and the themes of everybody looking to Washington and neoliberalism as the fear of the expansion of the United States, there is this issue that maybe that's not really a safe way to go.
Yeah, and of course Dilma just got through with the really close vote there, didn't she? So otherwise that cash transfer program would have probably...
I have a point on that. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a tension between Peter's presentation and the account he gives and Richards, because let's use this sort of concept of the opportunity structure to illustrate the point. I mean, I could have interpreted you, Richard, perhaps wrongly, as saying what one has to do is to adapt to the opportunity structure. And you could argue that what Peter was getting towards, particularly at the end, with his sort of transformatory potential, was how can one change the opportunity structure? And it seems to me that if you look at, for example, the social democratic welfare state in Europe, the opportunity structure following the Second World War was what made that possible. And in the 1970s, that opportunity structure changed against labour and capital, and therefore that was no longer possible. And so the idea is, are there reasons you have for thinking that at the moment your, as it were, mild social democratic programme would actually be able to work in the existing opportunity structure, and if it wouldn't, or if it wouldn't be able to work to the extent to which one would like it to work, i.e. stop being a mild one and become a more transformatory one, then how does one engage in ways that change the opportunity structure to make it more possible to move in a more radical direction?
Yeah, and again.
Well, thanks for.
Back, yeah.
I will just encourage you to come up here again for I don't know, maybe I clarify or something.
Not on the post.
Just quickly. Of course, I asked my question, expecting a little bit of that response. What is wrong with the welfare state? Just quickly, I agree with the comment that was made that politics of nostalgia is not necessarily very productive. So there's that. But also, I think I don't necessarily have the time nor necessarily the resources to kind of go into it. But I think that we went from developmentalist states and welfare states to neoliberalism at some point. And if the welfare state, or if the developmental state, or more like the welfare state, was such a high achievement, right? If that was such a high achievement, or the highest achievement of the 20th century, then what was its weakness, and how did we slip into neoliberalism? If it was so great, then why are we here now? Because that was the state so there's something that needs to be problematized there about if that was such a wonderful achievement. It's not like we had a war or anything, or I think we had an unrecognized war, which were the dictatorships in Latin America. So maybe colonialism needs to come into this. All sorts of things would need to come into. So that's just my quick comment.
Yeah, I can just wanted to throw one thing in. It's a comment I think on the first day that Radhika, is she still here? Made. She left, but she made the point about actually there's a lot of stickiness in the achievements that have been made, and that we haven't precisely returned back to the 1930s precisely because of a lot of the automatic mechanisms, the fact that Keynesianism is even accepted as a principal response, at least in the centers, perhaps not in the peripheries, so to speak. But yeah, anyways, so I'm not sure we've completely gone, in that sense there's perhaps more nuanced way of understanding how far we've slipped back, right? But there's also been a demonization of the classic welfare state that I think we have to combat, and perhaps that's where the nostalgia comes in. But sorry, I'm talking too much in the chair.
It's just going back to the Latin American social and solidarity economy. Well, we have to remember that Latin America is it's not an homogeneous region, and it varies from country. And I kept thinking when I was listening to your presentations that, okay, it is an alternative to social and solidarity economy, but sometimes when you have this movement, this activism, and sometimes this activism translates, and they have some impact into the public policy, but this public policy in countries such as Mexico, which is what I know more, gets translated into something that is not what they wanted. It's not what they were pursuing. It's like the interpretation of the people who really do not know the inside of it. And it ended somehow constraining a little bit more of this, what they were pursuing of this. And also in some other countries, like in Cuba, that they open to social and solidarity economy. It seems it is only like for very small business, and it's not really like It's like a quick solution to get rid. It seems as a quick solution to get rid of these non-profitable businesses, and without a proper understanding of it.
Just because it's a really interesting conversation, well, we do have to stop. So please, last two comments, very quick, and 15-second responses from the and then we'll go to lunch. Yes.
I sort of felt obliged to make a comment on this subject because it's exactly the theme of my doctoral thesis, in fact, which is specifically on this issue of European social democracy and the inability of European social democracy to defend what was an extraordinary achievement. I think it does come down, because I think with moderate social democracy there is a problem actually, and I think it is to do with the opportunity structures and perhaps the inability to perceive emergent opportunities or the inability ideationally to deal with changes. And I think a lot of the problem, in a sense, is that European social democrats never read Polanyi. They weren't prepared to react appropriately when things changed. But I think to deal with the question of nostalgia for the welfare state, because I think there is I don't like the word nostalgia, but I think there is a motivational aspect, a kind of a discourse that can be created based on the sense of defending something which was so important and opposing the idea that, well, sorry, things have changed, so we need to give that up. Now, that's something which a lot of social democrats have bought into. And I think that's had a lot to do with why social democracy has become so marginalized within Europe, because they've effectively defected to the enemy. And it's, sorry.
Yeah, no, I have to shorten it.
Yeah, just to conclude, yeah. I think that's at least where I'm coming at it from, is that, yes, they failed to perceive actually what the need, in a sense, to create opportunities from crises rather than submitting to a counter-revolution, which is really, in a way, what we can see as being the neoliberal.
Can I just throw something in really quickly? Just talking about Europe, and I mean, I think the battle is not over nostalgia, it's about right now. I mean, Europe, Northern Europe at least, is way ahead of the US when it comes to health and education, you know what I mean? What? And the point is that the health and education is being attacked now, not in the past, right? And I think it's not a nostalgic issue, it's a political battleground that we're in right now. Because it is, health and education in Europe is not like it is in the US. I mean, and we desperately don't want to go to that position, right? Where health,
everything is okay with welfare state, but there is also some insufficiency in European social democracy. I think it was mentioned by the social movement in the 70s. First, there is a dependence on market economic growth. Second, there is a deficit of democracy inside the functioning of a welfare state. And third, there is no ecological question in the welfare state. So I think that what we learned from South America is that we cannot go on, and if it was defeated, it's because the dualism market redistribution is not enough. So we need to include reciprocity in another mix. And I think that what is very interesting is when they speak about the return of state in South America, for instance, Boaventura, they speak about a different state from the traditional welfare state with elements of equalitarian reciprocity inside and linked with horizontal networks in civil society. And I think that it's really important for us. And I just want to mention that José Luis Caravaggio, in a book we recently published about Reinventar la izquierda en el siglo XXI, develops a very strong introduction about Polanyian framework for Latin America history in 80 pages introduction, and I think it would be of some interest for you.
Great, wonderful. Well, just very briefly, just because everyone else will be.
Sure, I'm Carol at York, and I look at the social economy, but I'm interested in the black social economy, so people of African descent. And I get my I get really nervous and stressed out when I hear about, that the social economy or solidarity economy can be one that has this, emancipatory potential for all people, because within it it can be very exclusionary of the very people it's supposed to be helping, because you have these sub-elites who then take it over, and they may not be the direct elites, but there's some sort of elite that then sort of oppresses the very people that they're supposed to look at.
Yeah.
So I question that the accountability within even the social economy as the good guys of who's then supposed to be delivering for these very people. So where's the accountability? Maybe I think each of us could probably answer that.
No, great. So I'll give each person 10 seconds, 3 sentences. No, because we got to go for lunch, and but it's been a wonderful discussion. So 15 seconds. Very good.
Mind-burning issues. Is the middle class going to be a break on modern social democracy in countries like Brazil as it gets larger and more entrenched? Yes, it will. That would be a normal trajectory, unless there is an ability to create universalistic services of a high quality and accessibility. The basic idea behind universality is that it draws together the middle class and the working class and others within the context of services that all benefit from. So that's the only real way of getting beyond that problem. As for opportunity structures, well, one point I wanted to make was that the opportunity structures facing progressive governments in Latin America and elsewhere are sometimes more open than appears to be the case.
Yes.
But the point also is that, of course, one doesn't just accept or adapt to the existing opportunity structure. I mean, the point I make in the book is the importance of working at various levels, including at the global level, is the only way of dealing, to expand, to shift the global opportunity structure so it's more conducive to left initiatives. I should also add that I just dealt with the modern social democrats today as one case study. I deal with the others as well, but that was in the book and not in my talk.
Right. Thank you. So that was about 20 seconds, right? And yes.
I was particularly taken by the last two contributors. I think there was a bit of sanity there. The welfare state, not everything is cracked up to do be or was, and the solidarity economy isn't either. But I would argue very strongly against the politics of nostalgia for the politics of possibility. Most of my work's been in Brazil, not the rest of Latin America. And I was there when the PT was formed. My supervisor at the time was Cardoso, and Francisco Huerta was trying to set up the Workers' Party, the PT. And he was telling me a story. They took Lula to the north in this plane. He lived in Pernambuco, peasant village, and the plane's circling over the football field, and they could have a PT rally. And I think maybe there'll be a few hundred people, and they just see a swarm of people, overflowing the football field. And Lula looks out the window and he says, "Oh shit, we might win." So, I mean, that was how unprepared they were for government. And I don't think, if you James Petras, you say, Cardoso is a neoliberal, but according to James Petras, Lula is the Taliban of the neoliberalism, which is, slightly crazy. Now, but we can argue that with the mandate they had, they could have done more, they could have done less. But it's within the realms of the possibility. So I think studying Brazil would be what I'd say.
I agree with you.
On the differences between Rich and me, frankly, I don't think the two approaches are mutually exclusive. If we're looking for spaces to do things, then within the sorts of pacts and compromises Richard talked about, we can find spaces to do things. Similarly, in terms of building countervailing power and doing things, you can also find spaces to do things. So I don't think there's a fundamental contradiction. What we have to be cognizant of is the tensions between those two different approaches and models. On Erica's question about public policy often not reflecting genuine sort of CSR values and perspectives, I think Margie's work on co-construction is absolutely key in that regard. How to actually effectively build in participation into policy design and implementation. And what's I think happened here in Quebec and what happened in Brazil what happened until 2 months ago in Quebec is relevant, a week. And just the last point about within the field of SSE there are exclusions. Just to point out that the The book we're doing on social solidarity economy beyond the fringe, it's in, you'll be pleased to know, in the series called Just Sustainabilities, where the series editor is Julian Aguiman, where his concern is precisely the exclusions within the field of SSE. So we've purposefully sort of put it under that series.
Okay. Thank you very much.